Good morning, class 12. In continuation with the topic budget deficit, where I've told you in my previous session that budget deficit refers to a situation where the budget expenditure of the government exceeds the budget receipts of the government. That means it's a situation when the government budget is greater than the government receipts. And as already I've told you that this budget deficit has been classified into three important categories. First one, already we have done revenue deficit. Second, that is fiscal deficit, which we are doing today. So when we talk about a fiscal deficit, children, fiscal deficit is actually estimated accounting for all receipts and expenditure of the government. That means fiscal deficit is the excess of total expenditure. Now listen very carefully, okay? Fiscal deficit is the excess of total expenditure. Now this total expenditure includes the total revenue plus the capital over total receipts. Now this receipts include what? Revenue received plus capital receipts. Except borrowing. Very important, children, this point. Remember, except borrowing. I am repeating again, fiscal deficit actually includes the total expenditure. Now when we talk about this total expenditure includes the revenue expenditure plus the capital expenditure. And when you minus this total expenditure, which includes revenue and capital expenditure, with the total receipts, and the total receipts which includes what? Revenue receipts and capital receipts. Except borrowing. This borrowing, except borrowing is very important to remember. So we say that is fiscal deficit. Or you can also say fiscal deficit can be, let's say, budget expenditure minus budget revenue other than borrowing, or fiscal deficit is when budget expenditure is greater than budget revenue other than borrowings. See, every time I am saying other than borrowings because in fiscal deficit we do not include the borrowings. So in an easy language, fiscal deficit means total expenditure minus total receipts other than borrowings. So this fiscal deficit is, children, estimated as the difference between the total expenditure and total receipts. And it is often treated as gross fiscal deficit. Now when we said borrowing, so there are three sources of borrowing for the government. And this three sources of borrowing known as gross fiscal deficit includes borrowing from RBI, secondly borrowing from abroad, and third is net borrowing at home. So children, I hope this fiscal deficit is clear to you, which says when the total expenditure is exceeding or it's more than the total receipts. When we talk about total receipt, means we have including complete revenue receipts also and capital receipts also. Now children, do you know this fiscal deficit also has certain implications, as we saw the implication of revenue deficit. So this fiscal deficit is always estimated on the basis of, let's say, borrowing by the government. Because greater fiscal deficit implies a greater borrowing by the government. So when, let's see that when government tries to manage or to balance this total expenditure with the total receipts, that somehow the government goes with the borrowing, because already the expenditure exceeding with the receipts. So when government goes with the borrowing, that it has a number of implications. So if we talk about the implications, like we have an inflationary spiral. Word inflation itself telling you, let's say when the prices hikes. So children, when government borrows from RBI, so it is linked with the inflationary spiral. in the economy. And how it happens? When government borrows from RBI, then money increases, means the supply of money increases in the economy. And as the supply of money increases, it increases the price level. And this continuous increase of this general price level over a period of time, it leads to an inflationary spiral. Now, it's a situation where you can say the wage price spiral also, and that hinders the process of growth. Why does it hinders? Because when it's a situation of wage price spiral, it means the cost of labor, that is wage, it increase, cost of raw material increase, cost of credit for investment, that is the rate of interest also increase. So the economy comes into an inflationary spiral. So how worse or bad the borrowing could be? Then if government borrows to manage with this fiscal deficit, then the implication could be of national debt also. That means that government may lead to a national debt. Means if government borrows today, then it becomes a burden for future generation, as future generation has to bear that burden. So it's an economy where GDP growth remains low because significant percentage of national income is used to pay up the past debt. So GDP could not be increased. Then if we say because of the borrowing, even a vicious circle of high fiscal deficit and low GDP growth, it keeps on persisting. Now what happens? When constantly, let's say, because of high fiscal deficit, it leads to a situation where a GDP growth remains low. And do you know why it remains low? Because of high fiscal deficit. And on the other hand, fiscal deficit also remains high. Why? Because of low GDP growth. Now children, listen to me very carefully. I'll explain you how it happens. Why we are saying because of low GDP. Let's say GDP is low because of high fiscal deficit, and because of high fiscal deficit, the GDP is low. Why? How it happens? Now let's see. When there is a high fiscal deficit, it causes a low GDP. You know why? Because high fiscal deficit, it reduces government investment. When it reduces government investment, then expenditure on infrastructure or expansion is not done in the country. That means when government do not have money, then do not do the expenditure, let's say investment, and due to lack of infrastructure, it lowers the inducement to invest. That means low investment therefore leads to what? Low GDP. When the government is not able to invest, employment is not being generated, that leads to a low GDP. And when we say fiscal deficit is high, that means if fiscal deficit is high, the rate of taxation also remains high, and that takes away all the disposable income of the people. So AD is not generated, AD is reduced. If AD is reduced, that hinders the GDP growth. Now on the other hand, if we say low GDP leads to high fiscal, children, see, if GDP generates low revenue for the government, let's say particularly in terms of tax receipt, then low GDP raises the government expenditure on food subsidy and welfare program. Means government is not able to earn, but the government has to do expenditure on food supply or welfare. That is basically for the benefit of the poor people. So in this case, the situation of high fiscal deficit and low GDP growth persists for a longer period of time. So it's almost a vicious circle. Then we can also say there is a crowding out. Now what do you mean by crowding out? Children, high fiscal deficit leads to a crowding out effects. Do you know what happens? When there is a high fiscal deficit, it increases borrowing. When expenditure is more than the receipt, government has to borrow. So high government borrowing reduces the availability of funds for private entrepreneurs. Means the government withdraws all the money from the market. So hardly the money has been left for the private entrepreneurs. So it could be like a drought of funds in the market, which leads to high rate of interest. Now, high rate of interest, it lowers the level of investment in the economy, because when rate of interest is high, money has been reduced, there is a drought of money in the markets. So the people who provide, they raise the rate of interest. When they raise the rate of interest, that reduces the level of investment in the economy. And economy slips into a state of economic slowdown. Then comes the erosion of government credibility. Very, very important. Children, see, it takes almost years, to come up with that credibility within the world for a country. And it takes just a minute to ruin that. So high fiscal deficit, it erodes the credibility of the government in domestic as well as international money market. That is, the credit rating of government is lowered. Global investors, they start withdrawing the investment from the domestic economy as they come to know that the country is in fiscal deficit. So they start withdrawing the investment. Demand for domestic currency starts declining. Exchange rate starts rising. Imports become expensive. And government expenses on imports starts peaking up. Now it's a situation that we start importing the inflation. So domestic investment starts shrinking. The government is left with no other option but to open up a domestic market for the foreigners, for the foreign investors. And when foreign investment increases, the domestic economy, let's say, may take a kickstart, but not without surrendering its control to the outsiders, that is non-resident. So children, this fiscal deficit must not be allowed to rise beyond a manageable limits, because high fiscal deficit gives a signal of a worse situation within the economy. It points to a situation when GDP growth can be lowered, unemployment can be high, revenue of the government will be lower, welfare will be very high because the welfare will become expensive, and economy will slip into a situation of, let's say, stagnation. So these fiscal deficit has to be controlled by the